Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahei Jurgen. We're going to study Psalm 63 in this lesson, and we'll begin by reading the psalm in its entirety. A psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judah. Psalm 63, beginning in verse 1. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest foods. With singing lips my mouth will praise you. On my bed I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night. Because you are my help, I sing in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you. Your right hand upholds me. Those who want to kill me will be destroyed. They will go down to the depths of the earth. They will be given over to the sword and become food for jackals. But the king will rejoice in God. All who swear by God will glory in him, while the mouths of liars will be silenced. Let's talk about this psalm together. The title of our study is Desperately Reaching for God, a study of Psalm 63. Most people are familiar with the expression, desperate times call for desperate measures. Now, the origin of this saying is uncertain, but the leading theory is that it derives from a similar expression from the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates. He once wrote, "For extreme disease, extreme methods of cure as to restriction are most suitable." Now, the saying, desperate times call for desperate measures, has a certain ring of reasonableness to it, but I think it's also deeply flawed and potentially dangerous. First of all, how can one determine when a time is truly desperate? Moreover, are there any limits to the desperate measures one would be willing to take? The difficulty in answering these questions reveals the potential for great evil to be enacted based on one's personal notion that the time is desperate enough to justify any action. History is filled with strong men who use scare tactics to convince people that their time was truly desperate and they needed to empower this man to take the most desperate measures available. Rather than desperate times call for desperate measures, perhaps a more biblical approach is to say, desperate times call for divine measures. Now, this doesn't mean that believers just sit back and do nothing in hopes that God will intervene in every situation. However, when a problem reaches the level of desperation and the people of God are at a loss for what to do, rather than taking matters into their own hands, believers must reach out in their desperation for the divine, for God himself. Psalm 63 is a psalm of trust in God. But the language of this prayer depicts a weary author who, in his desperation, is trying to reach out to God. Whereas Psalm 62 is filled with uncertainty, Psalm 63 asserts a more confident vantage point. Nevertheless, Psalm 63's earnestness demonstrates the difficulties of reaching out to God when desperate times come. The superscript of Psalm 63 says, a psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judah. There were two significant times in David's life when he found himself in the Judean desert. The first was his flight from Saul, which of course has been a prominent point of interest in this section of the Psalter. The second desert experience occurred when King David's son Absalom led an insurrection against his father. Now, Psalm 63 closes with these words in verse 11, "But the king will rejoice in God, all who swear by God will glory in him, while the mouths of liars will be silenced." And since the rest of this psalm is written from David's own first-person perspective, this verse here at the end implies that David is the king who rejoices in God, and this leads us to the probable conclusion that Psalm 63 is about David's flight from Jerusalem during Absalom's rebellion, rather than his escape from Saul. The time of Absalom's rebellion was especially difficult for David. It was the focus of the very first Davidic psalm in the Psalter, Psalm 3, which has the title, A Psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. Another clue that this psalm is written during a later period in David's life is the particular verbal form that's repeated throughout the prayer. Golden Gay says that the verbs in this psalm describe aspects of the ongoing dynamic of David's life rather than a one-time event. And so Psalm 63 is about a lifetime of reaching for God during seasons of desperation. As Golden Gay further explains, the life that constantly reaches for God involves searching, thirsting, fainting, bringing to mind, muttering, and cleaving. But it also involves looking, seeing, being filled, being supported, being delivered. And further, it therefore also involves glorifying, worshiping, lifting hands, resounding, praising, rejoicing, and exalting. Okay, with these introductory thoughts in mind, let's turn our attention now to the text. Psalm 63, a psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judah, verse 1. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. As David looks around the Judean desert, he realizes that his physical predicament perfectly illustrates his inner turmoil. He opens his prayer using the language of covenant. You, God, are my God. You might recall that in anticipation of the exodus from Egypt, Yahweh told Moses, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Exodus 6 and verse 7. David has spent a lifetime in covenant with God, and based on that relationship, he now earnestly calls upon the Lord for help. Now, this is not the first time the language of thirsting for God has appeared in the Psalter. Psalm 42 famously opens, as the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. All right, let's move now into the next section, which begins in verse 2. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods, and with singing lips my mouth will praise you. Now, throughout the Psalter, David occasionally found himself separated from the holy place, the place where God can be worshiped. Sometimes, of course, he was on the run from Saul. Other times, he was maybe leading an army into battle. And during these instances of physical separation from the sanctuary, David frequently recalled what it's like to experience God's divine presence. Not only does David miss seeing God's power and glory, he is also reminded of God's unfailing love. The combination of God's power and love connects this prayer here to the previous psalm, Psalm 62, which closed by noting, power belongs to you, God, and with you, Lord, is unfailing love, verses 11 and 12. Now, David's reminiscence of God's power and love prompts him to praise. My lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. And this outburst of praise is accentuated in the next line. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips my mouth will praise you. Now, David begins by telling us that he's thirsty. But of course, he's also starving. He's hungry. However, even though his stomach aches for God, it is again the remembrance of God's love that fills him with satisfaction. As if he has dined on a festive meal, he now feels satiated in the worship of God. There's a really interesting progression of movement in this psalm, and I think it's important that we track this movement. It begins with the image of a desperately thirsty man who is weak and searching for water in the desert. As the man begins to see a source of water in the distance, which of course in this case is God, he lifts up his hand as if to reach for it. Verse 8 says, I cling to you. So David pictures himself as trying to raise his weak hand skyward, as if to take hold of God. However, in his weakened condition, he needs help. And that help arrives in the next section, which begins in verse 6. On my bed, I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night. Because you are my help, I sing in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you. Your right hand upholds me. Tanner explains the significance of the bed and nighttime imagery as well as the shadow of God's wings. Sleep is a time when a human is the most vulnerable to surprise attack and injury. It's also subject to nightmares and terrors. In Psalm 6, the bed is a place drenched with tears. But here, the one praying can remember and meditate on God in the shelter of God's wings and find rest. The image of God's wings can also reflect the wings over the Ark of the Covenant, recalling the image of the sanctuary from verse 2. This one is content with God as his help, both day and night. Now, I want to remind you, the larger imagery of Psalm 63 is David's effort to reach out and take hold of God. But in his weakened condition, David needs a helping hand. He finally gets that hand in verse 8. I cling to you, your right hand upholds me. When the Amalekites attacked the recently emancipated Israelites, all Moses had to do was uplift his staff, and Joshua's fighting men would prevail. However, as the battle carried on, Moses grew tired. Aaron and Hur came alongside Moses and held his hands up, one on the one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steadfast, steady, till sunset. Exodus 17 and verse 12. In Psalm 63, it's not Aaron and Hur who assist David. It's God himself who stretches out his right hand to grasp David's weak and outstretched arm, lifting him up and keeping him secure. Now, in the next section, the reader is finally introduced to the source of David's difficulty. Verses 9 and 10. Those who want to kill me will be destroyed. They will go down to the depths of the earth. They will be given over to the sword and become food for jackals. There's almost nothing as ubiquitous in David's Psalms as the presence of enemies. However, little attention really is paid in this psalm to what the enemies are doing, other than, of course, the fact that they're trying to kill David. The focus is rather on what David expects will happen to these murderers. Now notice there's no petition in this section. David's not asking God to do anything, to destroy his enemies or anything else. However, he does expect that they will meet their demise. And notice that there's a contrast between the direction David is headed and the trajectory of his enemies. God has reached down to clasp David's hand and is pulling him up to safety beneath his outstretched wings. David's enemies, however, are going down to the depths of the earth, which is the furthest away from God one can be in the way the ancient Hebrews thought about the world. Now, once they have died, they will become food for jackals. Many cultures of ancient Near Eastern people believed that not being buried was the worst fate that could befall a person who died. God even legislated against leaving corpses out in the elements. In Deuteronomy 22, verses 21, verses 22 and 23, we read, if someone guilty of a capital offense is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land Yahweh your God is giving you as an inheritance. And so, While God is pulling David up, the king is convinced that the actions of his enemies will end in their utter ruin, which includes the shame of being left unburied so that wild animals feast on their corpses. David's psalm of trust concludes with these words in verse 11, "But the king will rejoice in God. All who swear by God will glory in him, while the mouths of liars will be silenced." You know, it could be that this shift from the first person to the third person, referring to the king, means that this psalm, while originally from the pen of David, was intended for future kings to recite as well. David begins this psalm as a dying man in the desert. But once God has uplifted him and his enemies have fallen away, David can truly rejoice in God. Of course, even though he was thirsty and hungry earlier, he still found strength to praise God for his power and love. But now, David has also found joy. God's power, God's love, God's rescue have brought him joy. And that joy is not just for David. Remember, this prayer begins with the line, "You, God, are my God." And now that we've come to the end, David extends a kind of invitation for others to swear by God. Verse 11. Now, swearing by God is pledging allegiance to him. It signifies entrance into covenant with God, which of course grants one the privilege to call God my God. And this idea reveals what I think is the true meaning of the fourth commandment. "You shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain." Exodus 20 and verse 7. To take or to bear the name of Yahweh is to claim him as one's God. To say, Yahweh is my God, I belong to him. But of course, to do that in vain would be to claim to belong to Yahweh and yet not live accordingly. Not live as Yahweh desires for one to live. And so David at the very end adds this statement, "The mouths of liars will be silenced." The liars are probably those who bear the name of Yahweh, but do so in vain. They claim to follow him, but their evil deeds reveal the truth. They have not truly pledged allegiance to God. Their deeds will expose them, and their mouths will be shut. Now let's just consider a couple truths we can gain from this psalm. First, I want to say that people who live in desert environments don't need to be reminded of the dangers of heat and dehydration. Abraham and Abimelech once argued over who owned a particular water well in Genesis 21. One of the first complaints lodged by the Israelites against God and Moses was the lack of water and food in the desert, according to Exodus 17. And for hundreds of years, many Israelites had to learn how to live in arid places. Up to the time of Jesus, the hungering and thirsting imagery continued to have potency. Now, Jesus famously said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." Matthew 5 and verse 6. It's no wonder then that Jesus identified himself as both the bread of life and as a source of living water. "Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." John 6 and verse 35. One beautiful and powerful line in this psalm that I think bears special attention is from verse 3. "Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you." Or, as the NLT renders it, "Your unfailing love is better than life itself." Well, that's an amazing statement. Consider what Wilson has to say about this line. What would we be willing to die for today? Not too much in our comfortable society. Perhaps we would give up our lives for family, that is our spouse or children. But our psalm tells us that God's love, his chesed, is better than life itself. Krauss puts it well, even life, which in the Old Testament is the highest good, pales in the brilliance of chesed, which alone provides the gifts of satisfaction and fulfillment. Is there some way here and now that the love of God, his fierce loyalty to his covenant relationship makes that kind of difference in your life? Does it make such a difference that it wouldn't be worth living without? Is your connection with God so important to you that you would sacrifice all your future hopes and dreams to keep connected with God? David knew that the power and love of God were always with him. And because he believed that God's unfailing love is better than life itself, he was able to endure various wilderness experiences that brought him great difficulty in life. This conviction also helped David from embracing the belief that desperate times call for desperate measures. David wasn't sinless. He made all kinds of mistakes, but his relentless commitment to God helped to temper the wielding of his own kingly power. Knowing that God was in control prevented him from becoming a despotic monster. And it also confronted him with the challenge to live in accordance with the will of God, not to bear the Lord's name in vain. These truths, of course, comforted him as well. Knowing that wicked men lurked around every corner, he was still able to find peace, to sleep in the soundness of God's protection. And so, we close with some thoughtful prayers. May all of God's people embrace David's conviction concerning the supremacy of God's love over all. May all of God's people cherish his unfailing love and hold firmly to it, especially in times of trouble. May all of God's people trust in the Lord and surrender everything to him. Thank you for joining me in this study of Psalm 63. Come back next time as we continue through the Psalter. Until then, God bless.